Sorry that we're starting a little late. My security detail held us up, not.
Truth be told, I apologize for being late. I grew up in a home where punctuality was next to godliness. Being on time is so very important to me, and I failed this evening. I will share a quick anecdote. When I began as a secretary, I was quite late for a meeting with about 20, 25 people, and I was profusely apologetic. And somebody said, you don't have to apologize, you're the secretary. And that has put more pressure on me to be on time. The idea that somebody could keep others waiting because of one's position is profoundly offensive to me. So I do apologize.
Well, thank you for being here, Secretary Mayorkas. Let's dive right in. AP recently reported that the number of border crossing arrests at the southern border rose slightly from July to August, 56,000 to 58,000. Can you confirm that increase? Why is that happening?
So that, yes, I can confirm the increase. One can have a few days where the number increases by a few hundred and you reach a 2,000 person increase in the number of encounters in a particular month. That is not a material difference when one compares where we are now to where we were, or quite frankly, where the country was in 2019. We are encountering a number of people now on a daily basis that is at a lower rate than what existed pre-COVID.
Right, you're talking about a decrease from record 250,000 border crossings in December.
So December is an anomaly. Mm-hmm. We've had high numbers in other months, but December was an anomaly for one very important reason, that the Mexican agency responsible for border control on the northern border of Mexico had run out of funds, and therefore there was no ability on the Mexican side to really interdict or slow down the flow of people. We had trains carrying thousands of migrants that didn't have any enforcement capability to prevent that group of people from reaching the northern border and encountering our Border Patrol agents. So Mexico was historic for that reason. Mm-hmm. The president took note, deployed Secretary Blinken and me to Mexico to meet with President Lopez Obrador, which we did. He quickly funded INAMI, and the numbers in January dropped precipitously.
And then this year, the administration took another step, which was restricting asylum. And the asylum restriction executive order that the president signed was designed to be temporary until average encounters drop below 1,500 for 1 week on average. But the New York Times is reporting that the administration is considering extending the required period, making it so encounters will have to drop below that 1,500 for weeks instead of 1 week. Is that something that you and the administration are considering?
So Laura, I won't speak of the deliberative process, but Laura, what it indicates is if the numbers are below 1,500 for 7 consecutive days, then we lift the more restrictive conditions. Those restrictive conditions, by the way, do not foreclose asylum. What we have done is we have raised the bar in order to make an asylum claim, because quite frankly, the asylum system is in desperate need of reform. And what we have accomplished through the executive action, which is being challenged in the courts, is something that would have been captured on a more enduring basis in the bipartisan legislation.
That executive action, when you're looking at lasting effect on the immigration system that this administration has had, that executive action, some immigrant rights groups argue, has resulted in a significant erosion of asylum. How do you view your legacy and the fundamental principle of U.S. immigration law and how it's changed?
One has to take a look at how the pursuit of asylum has changed over the years. One cannot analyze the president's proclamation or our implementation of it through the lens of even 2010 or 2005. the whole landscape of migration has changed. First of all, the level of displacement in the region and around the world is at an historic level. But more importantly, when I was a prosecutor in the 1990s, individuals fleeing conditions in their home countries accessed the border predominantly on their own, but could be assisted by what we dubbed at that time coyotes, an individual, a loose affiliation of groups facilitating their transport. That is not the case anymore. The fact of the matter is people do not reach the southern border of the United States without the help of smuggling organizations. They pay thousands of dollars. And we have a responsibility, not just from an enforcement perspective, but I would respectfully submit from a humanitarian perspective, to cut those smuggling organizations out. That is an inhumane way of reaching the border, and not just financially. We see too much tragedy and devastation to people's lives. And so the model that we have built is to reach people where they are, to develop safe mobility offices in Guatemala, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and elsewhere, to plus up our refugee processing, to be able to have people reach America and pursue their persecution claims in a safe and orderly way, not in the hands of smuggling organizations. So the world of asylum has changed. Our underlying values have not. Our adherence to the conventions, international conventions, have not. What we are doing is driving order. Hopefully Congress will as well.
And I know that you said you don't want to get into potential future administration deliberations when it comes to adding or subtracting to this asylum executive action, but do you believe that U.S. law granting migrants arriving at the southern border, regardless of how they cross, whether it's at a port of entry, between a port of entry, do you believe that U.S. law that grants them the right to seek asylum should change?
I think that fundamental right should persist, but the details need to change. And let me explain how existing law has not worked and how it's fundamentally broken. People arrive at the border and they claim fear of persecution by reason of their membership in a particular social group. I'm going to generalize because the community of migrating individuals is by no means monolithic. Quite to the contrary. But for the sake of example or illustration, about 70% qualify for that initial threshold. It is low, about 70%. Their date of final adjudication of the ultimate merits determination of whether they actually qualify for asylum, first of all, that bar is higher, and that date of ultimate adjudication comes 7 to 10 years later. People live in the United States and work during those 7 to 10 years. Some have United States citizen children. They attend our schools. They attend our places of worship. They become integrated in communities. It becomes very difficult to remove them. That is not a workable system. And what we have sought to do is to shrink that 7 to 10 year period to a matter of days or weeks. And what we have sought to do is, while accepting asylum claims, to reduce the disparity between that initial threshold of credible fear and the ultimate merits determination, because what we have seen is disorder, and that is not good government.
You talked a little bit about how the method of people's travel to the southern border has changed. But as you mentioned, there has been a dramatic global shift in migration. Why? How did it change? And where do you see it headed next? So, profit is an incredible motivator of some, and smugglers have evolved over time. They've become more sophisticated over the last decade, and
Their sole motive is profit, and their sophistication has come at the expense of human life. And that has been a significant driver. We are also, country conditions have changed dramatically, and so we are seeing migration from countries that did not previously experience it. The country that comes immediately to mind in our hemisphere is Ecuador, where we've seen at times very significant numbers of Ecuadorians leaving on a daily basis because of the unprecedented level of violence in that country. Their president declared a state of war against the gangs. They have never experienced that. They historically did not have a problem with illegal drugs, and it was historically a country of transit for narcotics. What happened was the traffickers began paying the facilitators not with money, but with drugs. And it's very difficult, it's quite fragile to remain a country of transit rather than a country of consumption. And that is what Ecuador is battling for the first time in its history.
You were recently in Colombia working on root causes of migration, and that's something that also Vice President Harris was tasked with early on in the administration, addressing the Northern Triangle countries and root causes of migration there. Can you just pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us what was her role in that region?
Well, two things. One, I was in Colombia to work on addressing what those countries need to both enforce their laws of humanitarian relief as well as their laws of border enforcement. That was my mission to Colombia, and we had a trilateral meeting with the Colombians and the Panamanians. It's unfortunate that there's a curtain that needs to be pulled back, because it's been quite unequivocally clear and explicit that the Vice President's role has been in addressing root causes. And root causes can be violence, poverty, extreme weather events, corruption, and the Vice President has done an extraordinary job in a public-private partnership driving resources to the countries in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala specifically, and having that public-private partnership invest in those countries in building industries and jobs and potential to give people hope. That is not a short-term solution. It wasn't with Plan Colombia of years ago, nor was it during the Obama-Biden administration. That's a long-term plan that is ultimately the solution. Addressing why people leave countries because they do not wish to do so if the circumstances did not require it. I can speak personally. My father never wanted to flee Cuba. In fact, he had to leave his dying mother's bedside to bring his family to safety in the United States. That was a choice driven by compulsion, not by a free and fair election, if you will. And so the Vice President has been driving to that long-term solution, and we have taken executive actions over the last year that have addressed the dysfunction in the immigration system.
What was it like to work with her in that space in particular? And can you give any insight into the role that she's played more broadly across the administration when it comes to border strategy?
She has been a driving force in not only ensuring that the government, through our resources, are assisting in addressing the root causes, but also in driving private industry. And I have seen her engage with chief executive officers and describe the imperative of that public-private partnership. That has been her primary role in the immigration sphere.
You talked about Congress and Congress needing to do more on immigration a little bit ago.
I would respectfully submit that Congress needs to do something.
That's true. It's been decades. So under the Obama administration. You helped implement the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program, and for so long, citizenship for dreamers has been something that has been on the negotiating table. Democrats have been pushing that, trying to get that. Whenever we've seen any kind of negotiations around comprehensive immigration reform and border security. But this time, when you were negotiating with Republicans and senators in Congress, that didn't appear to be on the table at all. And the grand bargain of 10 years ago is not present at all in Congress. What's changed over the last 10 years?
I think that the effort recently was focused on fixing our asylum system and fixing that part of the immigration system that was underlying the situation at the border. I think that was the focus of it, and there were certain other elements of the bipartisan legislation that were required to reach a compromise. It was a much more surgical strike than fixing the immigration system writ large, which hasn't been fixed since 1996. And it's just remarkable how the world has changed and our immigration system is not. I will tell you, we look north. You speak to state leaders, senators, House members on both sides of the aisle, and they will speak of visa programs and the need to expand the number of visas available under a particular program. And yet, despite a bipartisan agreement, nothing is accomplished. We look to the north with Canada. Canada takes a look at its market needs, and it says, you know what? We need 700,000 foreign workers to address our labor needs domestically. And so they build a visa system for that year to address the current market condition, and they say we're going to bring in 1 million people. And it's market sensitive. We are dealing with numerical caps on labor-driven visas that were established in 1996. It's 2024. The world has changed. It's remarkable how there can be agreement on something, on an agreement that it's broken, and not have agreement on a solution. The country is suffering as a result of it, not just with respect to the asylum system and the border, but family reunification, economic prosperity. Those are the humanitarian relief. Those are the three underpinnings of our immigration system.
I want to dig a little deeper here because, as I just mentioned, you worked under the Obama administration. You've been working on immigration in some form for a long time. And I know I'm young, but I was there in 2013 and in Obama's second term. I covered Congress. It is completely different when on this issue in particular, when it comes to what is even on the negotiating table. And the public perception of it appears to have shifted dramatically as well and more to the right. So what do you think is behind that? What is driving that?
So I can't speak of what is driving public reaction to it, although I do think that the situation at the border has squeezed some of the oxygen out of the room. I will tell you that I think, this is not a declaration that is in any way noteworthy, but the divisiveness in our country's political life is preventing progress that our country desperately needs, and that's not only with respect to immigration. What I will say about the divisiveness is a divide speaks of a chasm. It speaks of space, a vacuum, if you will, and that vacuum tends to be filled, and it is filled by our adversaries. Our adversaries, adverse nation states, exploit that divide, and I consider the divisiveness in our country to actually be a Homeland Security issue.
I understand you maybe can't speak to the public perception of it, but given someone who's trying to bridge that divide, you're trying to find compromise, do you think that there's an effect on the ability to bridge that divide by conservative media like Fox News if they're driving disinformation around immigration?
So I'm gonna stay away from that.
We're trying to have an honest conversation.
Yeah, honest can be with a little h or a capital H. That one's just that's a little bit fragile. I think the rhetoric, I have to tell you, and this is not with respect to one station. I grew up, we watched Walter Cronkite. I remember very clearly that at the end of the show, Eric Severide took over the microphone and provided an editorial comment. And the distinction between the news and the editorial was crisp and clear. I would like to see that return. And that is not station specific, that's just a general remark.
I'm gonna try one more time.
Give it a go. Give it a go.
Because of the fact that I understand that you said it's not just immigration that the divisiveness has created this chasm on, but on so many other issues, public perception matches what Democrats have been able to accomplish in terms of the Affordable Care Act, right? And guns. The majority of the public wants universal background checks. The majority of the public is voting in a way that appears as though they want abortion rights access. And on this one issue, you could argue that overwhelmingly the country does support different pathways to citizenship, does support comprehensive immigration reform, and yet it's not happening. So I guess what I'm just trying to hopefully see if we can dig a little deeper here on is, what do you see as some of the biggest barriers to getting that done?
Well, I was, having participated in the Senate negotiations for the bipartisan bill, I thought that was going to get done. And I think that forces stepped in to prevent a solution from being delivered.
It's an interesting way of putting that.
Thank you. That was a negotiation that was difficult, that was persistent over a few months, and was truly bipartisan. And the negotiation was a compromise, and a compromise on both sides. And I would respectfully submit that I doubt that the individuals who were at the table were lone actors as distinguished from representative voices. And that bipartisan solution would have delivered the most significant change to a broken system in over 20 years. And it is very unfortunate from the perspective of the interests of this country that did not occur. It is not the first time in history that some elements of a society have pointed to migrants as a source of social ills for which they are not responsible. That is a phenomenon that is not unique to the United States historically and right now.
As the son of Jewish and Cuban immigrants and of a mother who survived the Holocaust, what do you think, what goes through your mind when you hear Donald Trump, the former president, say that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country?
So I'm going to detach it from the individual, as I must, given legal constraints. I abide scrupulously to the Hatch Act requirements. That rhetoric that I have heard espoused by people is odious. I don't know what to say. People have died because of that rhetoric. My mother's family, her father's 8 brothers, parents, sister, died because of that rhetoric.
And I understand that you're going to also separate the individual that I'm mentioning right here.
Maybe you could divest the individual from your
the
question.
Individual from my
your question.
I don't know how to do that. So,
Okay.
Donald Trump has said he wants to carry out mass deportations of millions of undocumented migrants living in the United States. And some of his closest advisors have proposed deputizing the National Guard to go into Democratic-led states to round up migrants. What do you think of that proposal? How could something like that, how could an operation like that even be carried out?
That's an interesting question. An individual, from Venezuela arrives at the southern border, and they're going to be immediately removed. How exactly does that work under law? How will they be returned to Venezuela? What flight will actually take them to Venezuela? Will Mexico accept the return of a Venezuelan? Will they have been given process under law to make a claim for asylum? What if they manifest fear under our executive order, assuming our executive order withstands legal challenge? And if not, and the standard is reduced back to what it was, it is lowered. They need not manifest fear. They express it, and we ask questions with respect to whether they do have fear. And Mexico says, no, we're not taking Venezuelans back. What exactly does it mean to immediately remove an individual? What process will be provided to them? With what resources will mass deportations occur? Where will those individuals be held? What will be the funding for that? What if some of those individuals claim fear under our current laws? What process will they be given? What if a judge grants their claim? What if an asylum officer finds that they established a claim of credible fear? We're funded for 36,000 detention beds or so, give or take. So where exactly are they held? With what funding? And under what conditions? Because there are legal decisions that govern the conditions in which individuals must be detained. There are standards of detention. Politics is different than governing. Governing involves not just policy, but operational realities. There are funds, there are people, there are facilities, there are transportation assets that need to be considered when one is talking about executing a policy. And so I will be, I would like to see an operations plan to bring this to life, and I don't see it.
Would the National Guard have to be deputized as they're proposing, considering that there potentially wouldn't be enough Border Patrol agents to do something like that?
So deputization of the National Guard to execute this mission implicates other legal responsibilities and obligations and relevant laws.
I want to...
And assets. And so what happens if one is thinking of deploying the National Guard in a particular state, and that state is actually hit by an extreme weather event? Extreme weather events are growing, only growing in severity and frequency, and the National Guard is deployed. So, I mean, we're not a single event department. We're not a single phenomenon government. There are multiple sources of pressure on our people, on our resources. Let's be practical here.
Let's talk about Texas, which is where we're...
And by the way, forgive me, I was speaking of operational reality. I was talking about practicality. I was not talking about policy. I didn't address the fundamental issue of whether that is good policy.
Do you want to say whether or not it's good policy?
It is not good policy.
I want to... We're in Texas, and there's a lot that's been going on in Texas when it comes to border, as you probably well know. And it seems like Texas is also instigating the federal government, stepping on roles that have long been the federal government's responsibility. Just to name a few things, Texas is building a border wall. It dropped a floating barrier on the Rio Grande. It kicked Border Patrol agents out of a park. It has sued to stop the Biden administration's immigration policies, and it has arrested thousands of migrants on state charges of criminal trespassing. And the Texas Tribune has documented cases of the Texas National Guard using physical force and shooting pepper balls to deter migrants. Why has the federal government not intervened more?
Well, so look, a number of the measures that you cited, Laura, are the subject of ongoing legal challenge. So the government has stepped in and addressed it. It is remarkable to me. I started my federal career as a prosecutor. My first introduction to immigration was actually prosecuting smugglers as an assistant United States attorney from 1989, and then ultimately the United States attorney until 2001. My introduction to immigration as a matter of policy and procedure was in the Obama administration many years later. This is the first time that in my 20 to 22 years of government service that I have seen a state act in direct contravention of national interests and in the service of what I would respectfully submit politics. Let me take a simple example of secondary screening of trucks that are crossing from Mexico into the United States. The state conducted secondary screening of those trucks without coordinating with the United States Customs and Border Protection that is responsible for the screening of people and cargo coming through our ports of entry. It wreaked economic havoc on trade, and it served absolutely no law enforcement purpose. It just wreaked economic havoc. The busing of migrants from the border, once they are released, to cities without communicating with the recipient city officials, deliberately refusing to communicate, cooperate, collaborate, is incomprehensible to me from the point of view of responsible governance. Is it purely, and this is more than a rhetorical question, it's a statement with a question mark at the end of it, is it purely to wreak havoc and disorder in the receiving communities to make a political point? And I have to tell you, I was driving down Massachusetts Avenue late one night on the way back from my office, and I saw a busload of migrants, and those migrants disembarking from the bus in the middle of a residential area. It is unconscionable to me from the point of view of governance and the interests of communities, as well as from a humanitarian perspective and the interests of those individuals who are in enforcement proceedings, which means that they will have an opportunity to make a claim for relief, and if they do not succeed, they will be removed from the United States. It's unconscionable from every perspective.
Another thing.
I think the concertina wire is the subject of litigation. The concertina wire is a barrier that prevents the Border Patrol from, with facility, addressing the needs of an individual that is already on United States soil that may be in need of rescue, including an unaccompanied child.
Another thing that Texas has done is it's passed SB4, a proposal that would allow police in the state to arrest people they suspect crossed the border illegally from Mexico into Texas. If the Supreme Court ends up upholding that law, how will it affect the rest of the country?
I don't know how that would be carried out. How exactly do you identify an individual who's suspected of crossing illegally if they are identified, if they are observed 75 miles from the border? What are the indicia of illegal entry? Just patently, what are the indicia of illegal entry 75 miles from the border? Do they get pulled over because of the brown skin? What if they are from Eastern Europe? What if they are, the demographics of the people encountered at the borders changed dramatically? How exactly is that going to be carried out? Hopefully we don't reach that question.
And border security and immigration is obviously a big part of your mission at DHS, but there are a lot of other parts of the job. And
thank you.
So
I don't know if people understand what's in the Department of Homeland Security. Let me just rattle through the 8 operational agencies. Oh. Let's start with the border, and not just the border.
I do have a few more questions.
Yeah,
but okay.
U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which administers our legal immigration system. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is not only enforcement in the interior of the United States, but includes Homeland Security investigations, which is the second largest federal criminal law enforcement agency, theft of counterfeit goods, cyber crimes, online child sexual exploitation, abuse, a whole range. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is not only the border, but the facilitation of trade and travel, enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and so much else. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, FEMA, United States Coast Guard, United States Secret Service, TSA, 8 operational agencies, 260,000 people. The breadth of our work is extraordinary.
And because there are other parts of the job, I did want to ask you about domestic and foreign threats. After the attempted assassination of the former president, DHS warned that domestic violent extremists or other actors may attempt to do retaliatory acts, may attempt to do follow-on violence in response. Is that still a threat?
Yeah, we're in a very heightened threat environment. I've spoken of that publicly, as has FBI Director Chris Wray. The terrorism threat has evolved very significantly. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we were focused on the foreign terrorists. In the second term, really, of the Obama-Biden administration, that threat of foreign terrorism, of course, persisted, but we saw also the concern of what we then called the homegrown violent extremist, the individual already resident in the United States, radicalized to violence by reason of a foreign terrorist ideology. What we have seen now is those threats persist, but we also have individuals radicalized to violence because of hate, a rise in hate, false narratives propagated on social media, other online platforms, personal grievances. We're seeing youth radicalized to violence, youth suffering loneliness, mental health vulnerabilities, very impressionable. And we are partnering with online platforms, including gaming companies, to address that real phenomenon.
When it comes to domestic violent extremists, what exactly is the Homeland Security Department tracking? And are you seeing any signs that there could be violence near or after Election Day?
So let me separate that. So what we do is we gather information, or we actually curate information that others gather from publicly available sources, and we disseminate information to state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement and other importantly situated people in communities across the country. So first-line responders are equipped with the latest intelligence and information, so they are prepared. They understand what the threat is, they know what to look for, what the indicia are, and hopefully to prevent something from materializing. With respect to elections, the threat streams are multiple, three primarily. There's the threat of physical violence, there's the threat of cyber attack, and there's the threat of disinformation. And what we do is we help state and local election officials, the frontline personnel. We equip them with training, best practices, information with respect to the threats. We work very closely with them in really empowering and equipping them with the tools they need to ensure the integrity of the elections for which they are responsible.
Are you concerned, though, that there could be more violence than there was after the last presidential election in 2020?
I think
Is there a heightened risk?
I think, Laura, it's our responsibility to be concerned and to drive vigilance born of that concern.
And then
I don't look at it comparatively, but the threat is real. The threat is real.
What about foreign actors? So adversaries interfering in U.S. elections. Just today, U.S. Intel and FBI officials told reporters in a briefing that Russia is a preeminent and most active foreign influence threat to this year's U.S. elections.
So I would draw a distinction between interference and influence. So, and I don't mean to get academic, and I'm not sure it's even an academic point, but are they trying to take voters off the rolls? I look at that as interference. Influence is spreading narratives on social media, on online platforms, surreptitiously to try to influence the electorate.
Is there a difference in how they're influencing the electorate this time versus last time? Because I think that in the briefing today, Intel officials were saying that they are just trying to foster conversations amongst Americans rather than have their own accounts and their own actors influence.
I wouldn't say they are trying to foster conversations as distinguished from perhaps influence people's perceptions, people's understanding of the issues. I think they're trying to foment discord, and I see a level of activity, a heightened level of activity by adverse nation states and increased capabilities as well.
What is the international terrorism threat picture currently, and did it change after the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel?
The We are seeing a reinvigorated ISIS, and I'll just use the ISIS from a global perspective because there are branches of it. We're seeing a reinvigorated ISIS of great concern. The propagation of hate, most significantly anti-Semitism, but also materially Islamophobia. We've seen the incidence of anti-Semitism spike dramatically in a post-October 7th environment against both communities of people. We're in October 7th, the immediate aftermath of that has made the landscape even more worrisome, domestically and internationally.
I think that we want to open it up to questions. I don't know if Evan is in place yet. Evan, you want to? Great.
Hi. All right, Laura, Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Can I use the term disinformation?
Yeah.
Since we have a lot of journalists here. I don't understand quite clearly the term misinformation. Because to me, in the public, at least generally, misinformation carries a weight, a pejorative, far heavier than does an inaccurate story. And I really would love to dispense with the term misinformation, because disinformation has an intent behind it, the intentional dissemination of false information. Misinformation is just incorrect, as I understand it. So when very responsible media reported inaccurately that the Israelis were behind the bombing of a hospital in the aftermath of October 7th, it was based on, the reporting was based on inaccurate information. Do we say that those outlets were guilty of misinformation as opposed to just inaccurate reporting, understandable, in the fog of war, a lack of clarity as to responsibility, reporting from the ground, misleading in many different directions? I'm not being critical, I'm just being observant. But do we say that the newspapers were guilty of misinformation? That carries to me a weight to it that has an implication of wrongdoing in my mind, and I would respectfully submit most likely in the general public's mind. I really don't like the term misinformation.
What spurred you just saying that right now?
Because it's something I've debated with a number of journalists whom I respect a great deal. I just think it especially at a time when the Fourth Estate is under siege, I'm especially sensitive to it. Having been taught in college by Kerry McWilliams, one of the early editors-in-chief of The Nation magazine, and being a journalism student for a while. But
is it that you think that we use misinformation correctly when reporters?
Well, technically it is used correctly, but I think the implication of its use drives a perception that is inaccurate. There is such a thing as an innocent mistake. Reporters, like everybody else, a reporter gets things wrong from time to time. If you're in the fray, you're going to get things right and you're going to get things wrong. If you're on the sidelines, it's easy. But when you're in the fray and you're reporting on war, some things are going to be right, some things are going to be wrong. Misinformation has a weight to it that I think is inaccurate with respect to the intentions of a journalist, the good intentions of a journalist. And I think it does us harm. Just a thought.
Thank you.
All right.
With that, Evan.
All right, Mr. Secretary, question from John from Frisco. What do you make of the rightward shift of the Democratic Party on immigration policy? In 2020, Democrats ran on the inhumane nature of President Trump's immigration policies, and now a lot of those same policies, the questioner says, are being adopted by the Biden administration.
I would respectfully disagree. Those policies are not being adopted. We have not eliminated the ability to seek asylum. We have not shut down our refugee system, one of the jewels of the United States. Quite to the contrary, we've increased the number of refugee admissions in a year. We do not separate families as a means of deterring others from migrating and accessing our asylum system. We have executed on the Family Reunification Task Force that the President established through executive order. We are not perpetuating the inhumane policies of the past.
If I could add on to that, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Secretary, but the Biden administration kept in place Title 42, the deportation era policy that was started under Donald Trump. And that was something that he and others had run on saying that they would immediately reverse it, and it wasn't. And now you're currently being sued by the ACLU, the administration is, for the asylum restrictions that have been put in place, saying that they aren't constitutional.
I would respectfully, we're litigating that. We disagree with that contention. We are continuing to enforce asylum law. Individuals can make a claim for humanitarian relief if they are encountered in between the ports of entry. As I've stated before, we have altered the process, we have changed the standard, and I think for the better, for a more functioning asylum system. And I would ask people who are critical, and I understand their perspective, who are critical of the measures that we have taken, were we working with a functioning asylum system before this? Were we? Were we when 7,000 people, 5,000 people are arriving every day in between the ports of entry in the hands of smugglers? And I would posit, or I would ask, what percentage of those 7,000 every day are fleeing persecution by reason of their membership in a particular social group? And they make a claim for relief, and their claim for relief is adjudicated 7 to 10 years later. What is that a functioning asylum system? And if the answer is yes, we will agree to disagree. And then if the answer is no, what is the proposal? And I would look at it objectively and with experience. I would look at it from the point of view of policy, and I would look at it from the point of view of operational pragmatism.
Okay.
Just going to leave it there. Okay. Mr. Secretary, Jenny from San Antonio asks, America would not have the strong economy that it has without migrant labor. How does America balance this with the need for keeping out criminals and drugs?
We're talking two very different things. It is our responsibility to keep out criminals and drugs. And we have three objectives in our immigration system: economic prosperity, family unity, and humanitarian relief. And the question presupposes that those two forces of welcoming people as our laws permit, and preventing people from entering who wish to do us harm as our laws require, those are not conflated. And the people who are, whom we encounter at the border, who are making claims for relief, it is my view, and I've articulated it, Laura, in our discussion, it is my view that given the landscape of migration and the fact that the smuggling organizations are increasingly aligned and increasingly becoming identical to transnational criminal organizations, not just in our hemisphere, but in Europe and other parts of the world. We have an obligation to drive migration differently than in their hands. And I resist the conflation of people seeking a better life with criminality and the smuggling of drugs. Not always, but the vast majority, those are not deserving of conflation.
All right. A high school student from Austin asks, at a time when someone who is exactly my age killed 4 people in Georgia, how does Homeland Security plan to build on what has already been done to address school safety?
So it's a really important question. So a number of things. Let me identify 3 lines of work, and there are more. One, we're working with local communities on school safety and disseminating best practices for schools in communities big and small. We do that through the United States Secret Service. We do that also through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We have a very significant school safety initiative, number 1. Number 2, we're disseminating information to communities with respect to the threat landscape and what we see on social media. 3, very importantly, we're taking a public health informed approach and empowering communities to develop the infrastructure to deal with individuals who are vulnerable to radicalization or violence. And I've spoken about this inside the department quite a bit. You know, we're approaching a See Something, Say Something Day. I think it's the 25th of September, I think. If you see something, say something, to me, is a message that I think the public thinks of the abandoned backpack by a bus stop, a suitcase that's unattended at an airport. They're not thinking of the individual, the young person attending school who used to be quite social, who is now withdrawn and acting and behaving in a way that gives people cause for concern for that individual's well-being. Whether they are increasingly isolated, whether they are making statements that are of great concern to their friends, people in positions of trust, a school administrator, a counselor, a teacher, a parent, a sibling, a neighbor. And the See Something, Say Something doesn't fit that paradigm. And we're working on perhaps a new chapter in that public awareness, but we're working in communities across the country in a public health informed approach. Denver has a remarkable architecture in its city where law enforcement is working very closely with nonprofit organizations, with health care institutions, a very holistic approach.
In the case of Georgia, though, Mr. Secretary, I think
I wasn't speaking of that case.
I understand,
specifically.
but you're talking about see something, say something, and something was said. I believe it was about a year prior to the incident, and this student in particular had been questioned and was on the radar of law enforcement, I believe. So how does the country address that when a student is?
I don't want to talk about this case because obviously the facts will be learned. It's also the subject of prosecution and ongoing investigation. But there have been other incidents, the horrific Uvalde massacre, where a young man manifested signs of alienation and concern, where we're we have to make sure that we, as fellow citizens, are educated as to what those signs are, what the indicia, and it could be a need for help. It may not manifest itself in a horrific, violent act, but it's not just Uvalde. We had a July 4th parade, other manifestations. I can list a number of examples. We need to sensitize people to signs of alienation, risks, and I'm not driving to accountability, because the goal is preventive. The goal is to understand when somebody is in need of help and to be able to deliver that help. That's why I speak of a public health informed approach.
All right. Mr. Secretary, Sophia from Austin is originally from Germany, asks, how do you view the European Union approach on migration, and how could further cooperation with other regions and countries work?
So it's very interesting. I have said that the challenge at the southern border is a challenge not unique to the United States. Very interesting when I speak with my European Union counterparts, as well as counterparts outside of the European Union. The first thing that we talk about is migration, because these countries are experiencing the very same challenge. I think that we are all wrestling with a level of displacement that is historic, and trying to address it in a responsible way that adheres scrupulously to our values. And it is, countries approach it very differently. It is not uniform in approach. Take a look at the United Kingdom and their proposal to deport individuals, regardless of country of origin, to Rwanda. An outlier, perhaps.
All right, last question, Mr. Secretary, as time is running out. Henry from Austin asks, you faced intense questioning during Senate hearings. How do you stay composed and effective in defending your department's policies while under such scrutiny, and what advice would you give others facing similar high-pressure situations?
So, I grew up in government as a federal prosecutor. And I was in a courtroom where I had not a scintilla of doubt of the correctness of my position. And I was confronting a formidable adversary that was trying to prove that wrong, and deployed all sorts of tactics to achieve that mission. And I developed, I just had a strength of conviction. Yeah. And I have a strength of conviction in the work that I do now. And that's not to say that I haven't made mistakes and that I will not make mistakes, but I have 100% confidence in the integrity of my decision-making. And so when I'm attacked, I try to deal with the substance and drive by the rest of it.
I have one more question, just to end on kind of a look at the last 4 years since the president's term is coming to an end. 2 years from now, what specifically is going to tell us whether or not you've been successful as Homeland Security Secretary, whether it's expanding pathways for asylum seekers or on border security? What are you going to be looking at that will tell you that it's been a successful term?
Well, I would say when you're talking about the immigration system, Laura, which we have focused upon considerably, I'm going to shift the question, and I would ask Congress, how would you define your success in dealing with our nation's challenge. So that's how I would look at it.
Okay. Dodging the questions to the end. But
I thought I answered a lot of them.
you did. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, thank you so much for your
Thank you all.
time. We really
Thank you, Laura.